we're often forced by the data that's available to think about housing as a commodity and think about it as a function of a market, which takes away the human element of housing. And really, when you think about housing, it should be about a home, not a commodity.
Have you noticed that when it comes to housing choice, we actually are fairly limited? But perhaps you're someone that wishes that you could share a little bit more with neighbors, that you had more of a voice or a say in how your home and your neighborhood was managed. Perhaps you'd like to share more resources and activities. So if we want to have different housing choices, greater diversity, we need to know the data. Who wants this kind of housing? So in this interview with Greer O'Donnell of the Housing Innovation Society and the Urban Advisory, I speak with her about a growing sector of missing middle, as well as a growing group of people who wish to have more say in the kinds of housing that they would like to create and how they want to live in that housing. So the housing survey was created to be able to capture this information. And what this interview is about, the kinds of housing that we could have and how you, by taking part in the survey, can help redefine the diversity, the choices, and housing in neighborhoods that we can have in Aotearoa. Kia ora, and welcome to the Homefulness Show. I'm your host, Zola Rose, located in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We believe housing can be a means for regenerative placemaking to create affordable and sustainable homes and neighborhoods developed in collaboration with the communities that live there. We'll be exploring different housing models and neighborhood designs and innovation in energy, water, waste, construction, land use, and food systems. We showcase housing policies, finance, funding, and community engagement to unlock this potential. This show aims to empower you with knowledge, resources, and networks to support you in creating great places to live. Come join us as we bring to life the more beautiful housing that we know is possible. Welcome, Greer. Thanks for joining us on the Homefulness Show, where we're talking about more affordable, connected, and sustainable housing communities. I remember that we had that event in Hamilton called Connected Living in Affordable Housing. And we hosted a bunch of speakers, and you were one of the speakers. So you came and presented on your tour that you had taken with people from Aotearoa to Europe to show them all the different models.
Yes, the study tour where we took government officials to look at alternative housing models in Zurich and Vienna.
Yeah, and that event was bringing people from around the country who had seen housing innovation in other parts of the world and even were spearheading some initiatives in Aotearoa. And we were able to bring everybody together for one day, and we filled the room with about 200 people. And it was really fantastic to see so many people interested in that topic. Then it spearheaded the kickoff of the CoHoHui, which has been 3 years that we've held it, which is bringing people together from around the country who are interested in the topic of affordable and connected housing. And that's now been run under the banner of the Housing Innovation Society. Would you like to speak to the Housing Innovation Society?
The Housing Innovation Society was something that we were involved in starting after a previous study tour, actually, which we attended. And the group of people who came on that tour, who were from Aotearoa, thought it was a real opportunity to have a broader conversation about the types of housing that we might want to be available to us here. And so there was a group from architects and developers who had been looking at doing more socially and environmentally sustainable development, and that's where the Housing Innovation Society started from. It actually started as the Housing for Alternative Development Models, has since morphed into the Housing Innovation Society. The spaces are very filled with different housing initiatives in Aotearoa in terms of, we've got the Green Building Council and a range of other housing initiatives and community housing Aotearoa, Te Matapihi. There's a lot of entities that are advocating and leading the way with different housing kaupapa. And so the Housing Innovation Society was really about trying to find a space for people to talk about the different types of housing development that did not fit into any of those other spaces very neatly. And since it was established, the community housing sector generally in New Zealand has evolved, and we are seeing a range of different tenure and more socially and environmentally sort of thoughtful design. And so there are a range of different places where we can convene, and the Housing Innovation Society is just one of those.
So its lane is really meeting the need of those who don't, I think, fall as much into the social housing space, which is like community housing Aotearoa and the community housing providers, and who don't really, some do fit into the market, but the market isn't providing those different typologies of maybe more connected spaces.
So the mission of this, which we as a committee have refined to give us more focus this year, is mainstreaming collective housing. And collective housing has been given a definition by a publication that Mark Southcombe and the University of Victoria, University of Wellington have sort of published. And since then, there's been a number of different reports, the How We Live report, which Motif published alongside some other collaborators, including ourselves. That really references the defining features of collective housing as opposed to social or state or public housing. The housing continuum obviously has many different sort of segmentations, if you like, or cohorts, as they're often called. And I guess the way that we currently look at the housing continuum has been limiting in the past to certain groups, which are recognised models within the ecosystem. And what we really wanted to do with the Housing Innovation Society was to sort of bring or elevate some of the different tenures like cooperative housing, community land trust, and co-housing projects to the forefront, so that we had more of these projects available in Aotearoa, so that there was a greater choice of housing available for people. There's some defining features with collective housing. Generally has the community at the centre and playing a greater role in its delivery. The design itself is more centred around a community-centric approach. And then obviously the way that the legal structure and the ownership arrangements, the funding and finance is slightly different. And so there are examples of these in New Zealand, and the Housing Innovation Society is looking to elevate those projects like Tākaka co-housing, supporting those who are wanting to really unlock the value of the cooperative housing model. That very large journey that it takes to create a new funding and finance product. And so hopefully we'll see more of those, so that the existing projects are not so lonely.
And I believe there's a lot of advocacy that this has been doing in the space to elevate around the tax or the financial for lending from the regular institutions, and even some planning where maybe smaller or clustered homes would be different than the usual minimum size lot. So those are spaces where this has been elevating the need for that policy or financial or tax reform. So that's wonderful that any individual project isn't feeling like they're having to start all the way from scratch, that if we have all these projects that are, and leaders that are being able to network with each other, learn from each other's wins about where they've been able to get a bank to finance, or whether they've been able to get a local government to consider differently the planning rules, then they can use those as wins, and we highlight those, and hopefully those become easier.
Yeah, if we can tackle the systems-based issues around planning, regulation, funding, finance, it does make it easier for groups to get these projects off the ground. And there's a lot of headwinds for these groups at the moment, which is why we've seen a number of projects fail. And the society is just looking to remove some of those roadblocks where it can. But most of the hard work is done by those groups who are pioneering new models because they have to do it at the coalface. And not until we have lots of those examples will the system sort of catch up. But yes, we are trying to advocate for those systems change that we need.
And to be a member, just will give a plug for the Housing Innovation Society. To be able to be a member, what would be the process and the benefits? And then if you have any idea of the next CoHoHui as well, where people could meet in person?
Yeah, so you can just join up on the website, the Housing Innovation Society, and you just write that out in full. And there's resources on the website, more of which are being curated and uploaded so that there's a more substantial library of information for people who are interested. And the CoHoHui is being planned, lots of planning going on for that one actually. So it's a sort of every 2 years to give us time to sort of curate new content. It's obviously a slow moving part of the housing market. So yeah, next year we will bring industry together and have speakers from overseas and academics alongside developers and residents and potential residents, as well as those industry professionals who have certain skills, whether they're in the legal side of things or the design side, to contribute. We probably have quite interactive workshops, but more like a masterclass. So yeah, lots to look forward to.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, because at the moment, people just have to hunt and peck around or be able to reach out themselves to these projects if they want to get to hear their stories or meet them. So
Correct.
this will be wonderful for people to just plan their trip to be able to come up and then network and hear all these great presentations in one place and all the different topics and meet other professionals if that's their space or other future residents. I think now it's particularly gaining more momentum.
The team are looking at some site visits and things that extend into the weekend for those who have the time.
Yeah, that's right. That's always been included, visiting projects and also the students who have been working on these projects, whether it be in the School of Architecture or Planning, where they've been showcasing their studies, their models that they've been trying. So that's really great to see this cohort of learners that want to study it and showcase it as well. Yeah, and that there's universities that are hosting these students. So I think that helps as well to get that academic backing to these projects. Yeah, so we can demonstrate their positive benefits beyond the financial. I thought I'd just go back way to the beginning because I'm quite interested to know what is it that got you so passionate about collective housing and the work that you're doing in this space?
Well, I grew up on a farm and I spent a lot of time living on a boat with my family when I was a child, and so experienced a range of different living arrangements. And when I moved to the cities for university and then got into urban development as a career path, I found that there just seemed to be a lack of options and a lack of choice. And having traveled overseas and seen different housing options which suited people's needs, was more sustainable socially and environmentally and economically, and just generally provided an opportunity for communities to be more connected and for people to have healthier lifestyles. There was a greater level of equity in these communities. I mean, housing is a fundamental human right, and we unfortunately have far too many people in Aotearoa who don't have access to secure, stable housing that meets their needs, whether those be cultural or practical, whether accessibility issues, whether it's just preferences. And so I guess as part of the work that the Urban Advisory does in the urban development and city making sphere more generally, things always seemed to come back to the big challenges that we have here for creating a more equitable and healthier housing system. And so that's why housing kind of became a central focus for us at the Urban Advisory. And our mission is to create healthier and more equitable homes, neighbourhoods, towns and cities. So we work at all of the challenge. So it's not just at the individual home or house, but that neighbourhood and towns and cities levels as well. I think that's important because people don't live in a house in isolation of the rest of the community and the rest of the city that that house is located within. And so for people to have access to jobs, affordable transport choices, open space available, and access to amenities so you can get to the things that you need, your daily essentials, healthy food, chemists, education, arts and culture, and just your everyday activities, that the problems are all interconnected. So to have enough housing solutions which are fit for purpose requires us to think about the way that we plan our neighbourhoods, towns and cities differently. And so for us, it's all interconnected, but obviously there's a dire need around solving the immediate housing crisis. So we do work on those other challenges as well, whilst also focusing on housing.
And going back in terms of where that idea started to even start this firm or agency of the Urban Advisory, had you studied things and then met a few people who are like, yeah, let's work on this together?
I actually was a qualified lawyer and sort of transitioned into urban development through the Earthquake Recovery Authority after the earthquakes. And my other degrees that I had studied, anthropology and political science, were always sort of the things that were interesting to me, and the anthropology in particular because around the development of human culture, which obviously in our modern day context, you can't divorce the development of human culture and society from the towns and cities and regions that we live in. And so when I met my business partner, Natalie, we both had really interesting previous roles, and we were looking for something that we couldn't find in the job market. We really wanted to be working across different disciplines. I didn't come from a traditional planning or design or architecture background. And so when I met Natalie and we were talking about this, she was in a similar boat, and we kind of conceived this idea about urban strategy, which now is quite a common term. We use it often in the industry, but even 8 years ago, it wasn't very commonly used here in Aotearoa. And so we really wanted to do the type of work that we were interested in. And the only way really that we could see the pathway for achieving that was to work for ourselves. And so that's where the Urban Advisory stemmed from.
I see you've got a great team of people who share that mission now and have all those complementary skills to give a full team a set of skills to any urban planning.
The team's made up of property professionals, planning, design, architecture, social science. We've had all sorts of people with different backgrounds. They're part of the team over the years, and I think it's that real diversity of thought that enables us to really challenge the status quo. We have your more regular services like urban design and feasibility and planning, but a lot of the work that we do, including the research function of the business, is really about sort of changing the conversation that we have within the built environment industry. And we want to contribute some new thinking and new ways of doing things, because the current way that we have been doing things has led to not great outcomes for a lot of people. And so being in that role of challenging the status quo can sometimes be challenging, especially as we are a consultancy and not a think tank. But it's a balance between sort of objective consultancy and challenging the status quo, as is something that we're always grappling with. And our newest project, which I think is something that we were going to talk about, the New Zealand's Housing Survey, is one of our solutions to that challenge that we had been grappling with around having the right type of data and understanding the way people wanted to live their lives, which could support our objective fact and evidence-based consulting that we do.
I think that's one thing that you and I share in common, which I'm now hearing. I didn't realize it was actually perhaps our anthropology background that is driving us, because really this kind of housing is kind of cultural. It's meeting the values and the aspirations and the way that people live, and not assuming that everybody just wants the same thing or would be happy with just what's provided, and allowing people's culture to come through with how they design their living spaces and their neighborhoods. And so anthropology was something I studied, and I think that's woven its way through my work. And now I'm seeing and hearing that in you as well, that that's what the survey actually is doing. You're capturing, I think, that culture of people, and trying then to use that data to say, yeah, we need all these different ways of doing it. So, well, that's moved us quite nicely into the housing survey, so that we're able to understand what it is that you're looking to collect, and then how that data is going to be used. I'd like to take a brief moment to share with you about Common Ground, the consulting agency to provide professional services to enable more affordable, socially connected, resilient, and climate-adaptive housing and neighborhood development and place-based living. So Common Ground works with local government, with community housing providers, with for-purpose developers, and with groups of people wishing to lead their own housing initiatives. We provide services in housing strategy, design and facilitation of meaningful community engagement, research, policy development, training in new approaches to better housing outcomes. We also provide services in workplace culture and communication to create more cohesive and effective working teams and workplaces. So why work with Common Ground? Well, we take a whole systems and innovative approach. We have decades of experience in community and regenerative development. We have compassionate work culture. We're aligned with community engagement best practices of IAP2. Our knowledge is research-based, and we work with a spirit of joy, creativity, and collaboration. You can visit our website at commonground.net.nz to learn more about our services, to get 2 reports that we've written on housing for women and the Community Land Trust model, and please sign up for our weekly newsletter for inspirational resources, links to case studies that showcase successful initiatives and policies, and get announcements to upcoming events.
So New Zealand's Housing Survey is challenging the way we think about housing demand. The idea is that we'll understand more about how people currently live, how they would like to live, and what's in the way of them achieving those housing aspirations. And when we started the Urban Advisory, there wasn't a lot of data that provided us insights and information about those things. And there's stats, New Zealand, and census data, and there's a lot of real estate industry data around house price sales. There's much reporting about the cost of housing and it going up and down. And we're often forced by the data that's available to think about housing as a commodity and think about it as a function of a market, which takes away the human element of housing. And really, when you think about housing, it should be about a home, not a commodity. And so, unfortunately, people have built their wealth around property in Aotearoa. It's overwhelmingly the biggest asset class that we invest in as individuals. And so we've got conflated the notion of what we need for human survival and to flourish as people in a community with what we the market wants to create so that certain people can maximize their profits. So the housing survey is an initiative which has stemmed from much of the work that we've done. We've trialled it on smaller scale projects, maybe for a particular region or for a particular community or for a particular iwi hapu group. And it's been really helpful when we've been able to run those projects to get that data, but it's quite time consuming, costly. It means that we don't have consistent data across different areas because we only are collecting information in a piecemeal way. And so having a nationwide housing survey, which provides data that's freely available to people initially, means that people can start making decisions and considering policy and hopefully influencing the way that we design and influencing the way that we plan for our cities, can be informed by actual data that tells us more about how people want to live, where they want to live, the barriers in their way, and giving more insights into things about, do people value a higher degree of environmental sustainability within their housing choices? Do they value spaces for culturally relevant activities? Do they prioritize access to amenities over having garaging and their own lawn? So many of the things which we inherently think about and we make trade-offs about when we're looking at what's going to be the most suitable living arrangement for us, we don't necessarily know that we're making these decisions and these trade-offs, but through the survey, we really want to understand those things which people find really useful and valuable and those things which people prioritize. And that helps inform the picture of demand, so that demand is not just a thing that we look to previous sales data about. Obviously, if there's lots of 3-bedroom homes with 2-car garage, people will keep buying those because that's what's affordable, or affordable to some, unfortunately not to many. And if we keep creating that product, people will keep buying that product. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that we tell ourselves that's what people want. And we're hoping that the survey can add a different lens to the conversation about what people want from their housing.
Yeah, because it's been quite developer-led, and the developers are then using that market for the financial institutions are also like, well, we have to not do anything too risky. We don't really know what people want, so we have to go with what has already worked. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling. And also because it has been a lot harder, we don't have any not-for-profit developers that work on behalf of groups like you know of in Europe and the UK, where there's these intermediaries that act on behalf of the community. There's community-led housing groups that then get human resource to help them to then get through all these development challenges and hurdles, that like planning permission and rezoning and all of that, and maybe even to underwrite, where developers have a bit of financing behind them, so banks are happy to lend to their projects. A group that would like to create their own know what they want, but they don't have that means because we don't have the channels by which they can get that support. So let's go then to where you believe that the data is going to open up some doors.
So just on that point, we do have not-for-profit developers in Aotearoa, but we don't necessarily have the support for the collective housing sector as you were describing it. So there are some really awesome not-for-profit developers working in the community housing space. Kaingamaha is extending beyond social and public housing into mixed tenure housing. And there are examples of other not-for-profit developers. So we are seeing a rise, but we unfortunately still don't have those kind of institutional support for the collective housing sector or the community-led sector, which is different from the community housing sector. But some of the use cases, apart from things like housing needs assessments, housing strategies, plan changes, market demand analysis, and there's also a more longer term objective for gathering the data, and we're gathering it on a longitudinal basis, so over time, is to demonstrate how people's housing preferences do change over time, and to hopefully steer policy in a direction that is providing for what people really want. At the moment, it's really hard for Joe Public to participate in the development of policy, and public participation is a massive kind of factor in a democratic society. The World Economic Development Forum kind of highlights public participation, community participation as one of the key issues of the next 10, 15 years, and so into the future. So the housing survey is one way of getting an avenue for people to contribute their thoughts and perspectives. And as the data grows over time and it becomes more useful and more helpful by virtue of the quantum of the information and its duration and how long it's been running, it will hopefully guide some of those policy decisions and maybe help make it less of a political football of an issue. So we know that politics really drives the system settings which drive the housing outcomes that we have. And if we can have a cross-government agreement based on data around what people actually want, and there will always be arguments about the best way to achieve that, but at least we will have a foundation for an evidence-based foundation for some of those policy direction setting.
So it's really important at this point. You've released the survey, I think just over a month ago, and so it's out there, people can take it. I've already done it and I found it not very time consuming. So I highly recommend that folks do take that.
It's highly visual so that it helps people to understand some of the questions, because some of the questions use terminology which perhaps aren't common terms that we use on an everyday conversation. But yeah, on average, about 15 to 25 minutes, depending on how quickly you compute the questions and the answers. A lot of people have said to us that it's really made them think about things they'd never really thought about before. And I guess that in itself is a good thing, because people can't make choices about things that they don't know about. So if they have more awareness of the options that could be available to them, then maybe there would be more demand. And they say those who educate the market own the market, and we're trying to get people to think about housing not as a market but as a fundamental human right, and therefore we need to understand some more of those human elements around the attributes that we value in housing, the barriers and limitations to achieving housing that fulfills us and serves us, so that people are not only in secure, stable housing, but housing that meets their needs.
I think that seeing is believing. We can't necessarily know what we have available to us until we have exposure. And I think that was why you had done that trip to Europe with those decision makers, so they could, with their senses, be able to be and hear and see and touch what it is like to be in that kind of a living environment. Because some people might say, oh, higher density, I could never live in a 3 or 4 story. That totally doesn't suit the character, and that's not my style. And yet some of these developments where it's so green around that and the vibrancy of what's happening in between the buildings and just the architecture, when one is standing there and hearing and seeing and thinking, oh, actually, I can imagine this actually could work for me or for my children.
Having higher density housing is never going to stop us from having low density housing. It's not mutually exclusive. And I think that's one thing that we really want to drive home, is that higher density, more socially connected housing that's designed for community and for environmental and social sustainability, the elements of those might not be suitable for everybody, But it doesn't mean that we're going to all of a sudden not have those other choices which we have in abundance are still going to be available for people. So we're not taking away from anything. We're just adding more options, and that's what it's about. It's about choices, about options for people to choose an option that suits their stage of life, it suits their accessibility requirements, it suits their size and scale for their family, but also affordability and price point. And not until we have more and diverse options will we be able to tackle some of those bigger issues around affordability, which is something that we're grappling with a lot here.
I think all these changes do assist with the affordability aspect of it as well.
There's systems to support groups and funding and processes. There are housing options which are sort of 20-25% below market. At the moment, unfortunately, the projects which we have seen eventuate here in New Zealand haven't, in terms of the collective housing projects, haven't really tackled that affordability issue. But it is something that people are working on, and more houses in the system ultimately is going to make housing more affordable. More housing choices, which are more suited to people's different needs, means that it frees up our other housing for people as well. Elderly people, single people living in big homes, which they perhaps don't need to. There's a sort of a reshuffle of where people currently live, what land's available for development. But to enable that reshuffle to happen, we need to have the choices that work for people in the places where they want to live. A lot of people want to stay rooted in the community that they've spent their entire lives in, or more recently moved within that community because there's something within it that they value. And so we have to be really conscious that the variety and choice of housing needs to be distributed across the country in the areas where people want to live and where they currently have their community.
Yeah, I know in my area where it is more rural, the community was demanding, I think it was over 10 years ago now, for more cooperative living in rural areas where usually the zoning is only one house per hectare, or a lot of land around one house. And so the community advocated, the Tasman District Council responded, and they did a plan change. It's called Plan Change 60 under the title of Cooperative Living, and it does allow for more houses in a rural zone as long as it meets other criteria. It's got to be cooperatively owned or used land and buildings, and it's got to meet other consenting, but for the most part, it bypasses the need to subdivide or rezone. So that's really one case, an example where the communities come together, said, this is what we want. We're in a rural area. We want to be closer together. We don't want to have to move into a town to be closer together. We want to do it here where we're growing food or having our lifestyles. So I'm heartened to know that the community got together, that the district council responded, and we've actually got now the plan in place for people to make use of that in rural areas. Because I know I'm in a rural area, and I'd love to see this more collective opportunities in the rural areas. And I've recently held one event to help people understand a little bit about the policy. And then we're going to be having an event next month, which is talking about the legal options of what does that mean, cooperative ownership or use of land and buildings, so that folks can have those options to share land or buy together. And then I will have another event on the planning aspects of it. We'll have another one on the land use considerations. Might even include some things around the tiny home, because that's a whole nother thing. I've been asked to do some research on what would help folks to be able to either ease of consenting or no consenting for tiny homes. So all of that's going on in my rural area, and there's so much interest. And I think the council's interested to respond or to collaborate. So I'm heartened by that.
Lots of challenges and lots of areas for people to come up with ideas.
Exactly. I'm trying to advocate that people can, if they just organize, even a smallish group, then they meet with their council and be able to have that more collaborative attitude or energy coming with is, would you be willing to assist or work alongside us? And I would like every community to think about themselves as that potential advocate, leader, voice in their community, and to tap in. If they're a member of the Housing Innovation Society, it's that one step closer to having access to regular information, others who are doing it. Same thing with Common Ground. I also try to connect people and make resources available for people to feel empowered, and councils to feel like, oh, we're not the only one that's doing something differently here. Others are trying and experimenting with different kinds of policy and ways. I think that's how we share that work of educating and awareness and connecting. The housing survey, is that found on the Urban Advisory's website?
Yes, so New Zealand's housing survey can be found through the Urban Advisory website, on any of the social media channels. If groups are interested in rolling it out within their community, we have a package where we provide the assets and this was stakeholder engagement and framework for people to work on within their own communities and roll out the survey. And therefore we enter into partnership arrangement and analyse the data for those particular communities, whether it's a geographical community or defined in another way. And we've been working with a couple of different regions in Aotearoa on those partnership agreements. So if anyone's interested, you can reach out to us. The Housing Innovation Society is also doing a big push to its members around the housing survey.
I love that you've made it a tool and given the resources for groups in particular areas to be able to do that. So I'll definitely be talking with the folks in my community, the council, the board members, the local marae and iwi here and I know there's a big development to be happening in Mapua where they're quite interested to have their culture reflected in the master plan and how development happens. So I'll talk with all those folks and see how we might come together as a region to perhaps do that for our area.
That's awesome. And we have had Jade Kakia, who is a Māori housing expert. She's reviewed the survey for us along with some other kaupapa Māori voices. So we've also tested and used the survey in Māori context with either iwi or hapu and sometimes non-affiliated Māori groups. So there's definitely questions that cover the implications of whenua Māori land, but also lend themselves to finding out more about the types of housing that would be suitable for Māori. So, and not only Māori, for everybody. We have thought about that to our Māori lens. We have really tried to make sure that it's a usable survey for everybody, and it can be adapted for different groups. But the New Zealand Housing Survey itself, that we will continue running, needs to remain consistent in terms of the data and for it to be comparable over time. And so the survey itself, under the New Zealand Housing Survey, will remain fairly much as it is, but if groups want to adapt it or use it for a particular use case, we have done that in a number of instances as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. That is helpful to know that it can be adapted. So just a few final questions. I was wondering what books you're reading, anything related to the topic that others might find interesting.
I'm actually reading a novel at the moment, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's a book about memory and how we look back on our lives and remember them. Interesting in the context of housing, because the home and how we grew up and where we grew up has such a formative influence on our lives. And yes, this book is exploring one's life and the different places in which they have lived and the experiences that they have had and how that shaped them into the person that they've become.
That's that cultural anthropology coming again. And have you got any podcasts that you would recommend?
The podcast that I'm actually listening to at the moment is The Curve Classroom, which is actually about, it's a financial education platform for women, and it's about the knowledge that you need to build wealth. And so I like it because it's talking about investing in things which are not just property. It's talking about the mindset that you need to build wealth when you think about having that kind of financial freedom that so many of us aspire to. So yeah, the Curve Classroom is a really interesting one.
And were there any either websites or organizations that you think offer inspiring content or visuals or resources?
Left Bank, who are an Australian company, also have some really good stuff. Left Bank CO, short for company. Left, LEFT.
Well, I've recently discovered some podcasts around what's called strong towns. They're all around citizen advocacy for better towns, and housing is one of their things, and one called Upzoned, which I thought was really interesting, specifically talking around the zoning aspects and the justice issues around the zoning. It is based in America, where they have a different way of talking about it, but I think there's a lot of relevancy as well to hear that people might be inspired. We're not alone. We're part of a big movement. It's about connecting all of us doing our things so that we feel substantial and like, hey, these wins are possible in even a few years, not only in our lifetime, but I believe we're going to see incremental successes with the work that we're doing.
Well, that's probably a great place to leave it, because on that positive note.
Exactly. So thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing and for coming on to share with us about that.
Thank you. Ka kite.
Ka kite.